Welcome to the Newswire with me, your host, Tyler Dickerhoof. We have producer Alex back. He was on the road last week. I think we had a good conversation talking about Trump, but today, man, we're going to talk about this beautiful, wonderful state that I live in, Washington. As you may have gathered through the open, over the weekend, there was a situation that broke out at the Cal Anderson Park in Seattle. There was a registered event by one group, and then all of a sudden Antifa came along, caused a problem. There ended up being 23 arrests. That's kind of the tip of the spear. When you get into the rest of the story, there is the commentary from the mayor that came out and attacked the group that had a scheduled event that were holding a permitted event, saying that they were going against the ideology and everything else in the city. And you might think it was something, pretty, outlandish. And this was a conservative Christian group. And essentially the mayor said, we have no place. Those don't fit our values. Now you have people that are calling for the mayor to resign. To me, this is what it centers upon. Are we finding places in this country where all of a sudden freedom of speech and religious freedom no longer includes Christianity? That, to me, is the real piece of this conversation that I think we're seeing this in cities across the U.S. It's like, it's one thing, we have so many different religions in the world, right? And now all of a sudden we're starting to see these very, I would say, liberal, borderline woke, maybe not even borderline leaders that are going after and attacking the Christian, even if it's the far right. It is a labeled Christian group that went through the proper policies to get a permit and hold this event. And then all of a sudden there's a group of people that came after them. Now, there's some layers in this that really make it interesting to understand what's going on in the city. But as you've read into it, give me your take, Alex.
Yeah, I've read into it, and it seemed to me like there was this park. So we got to start with the park itself. The park is named after the first, I think, like openly gay legislator in the state of Washington. So it is like a grounds that the LGBTQ plus or a park that the LGBTQ plus community considers their like home turf, right? It's like this is their place, which is fine. That's cool. And then you hear from them, how was a conservative Christian organization allowed to, this is from their side, allowed to host an event at their park? They saw that as a slap in the face. So they want to bring it up with the mayor and the Parks and Recreation. How is this approved if you know that this is a group that goes against LGBTQ plus core values? And so like that's where it all kind of starts.
It's a real I would say it's a Western shootout, quite honestly, because as you bring up that point, the group, they wanted to go have their event in a different park, right? And the Park and Recs department said, no, you can be here. So there's kind of like this setup within the Parks and Rec department to say, whoa, wait a second. They asked to be at a different location. You said no to that location. You gave them the permit. You gave them everything to be in this, home turf.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, when it blows up, everyone's sitting pointing fingers and saying, how did this happen? And I think what, as you and I've talked about either on camera, much, much more off camera,
right,
is I don't think people in the other 47 states outside of California, Oregon, and Washington truly understand the major, say, fireworks, like the example of all this going on throughout the state in all three states.
And I think, Tyler, I think it would help like the audience to understand, like Seattle has been going down the shithole for the last several years with this mayor. Like this isn't the
I would say it's not even this particular mayor. It's been over the last, I would say, 10 to 12 years. And what I don't have the exact what was the start of it, but if you look back into a lot of the, I'm just going to use the term woke for lack of a better terminology, but I refer back to our conversations about Bill Maher and kind of this idea of it's so far over the top of I just want to be asked for, acceptance that I'm going to come after you because I'm going to try to prove to you that I'm right. And that's what that's what's gone on in California when I live there, more towards, different locations. But really in the last, I would say somewhere between 2010 and 2015, this West Coast, Washington, Seattle, the I-5 corridor, Portland, all the way down to, the Bay Area, I would say have really taken on this. We are going to really stand against any of conservative values. We're going to be major bastions for the lesbian, gay communities, which has now gone on to the LB, to the bisexual, the transsexual, the queer, like all of it, right? And then all of a sudden, now you have where homeless is pretty much overwhelmed each one of these three major cities, and that would be Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco. I mean, you go to any of the news media that has the gall to print about it, and it is just, it's overwhelmed. I mean, you go to these cities and you can't go through any part of the city and not see trash and litter and tents and just these large, overwhelming homeless encampments. And that has been the ideology of those three major city centers. And now it's coming to this forefront. Now we're seeing that not only is this a part of these city centers, but now it's pushing out through the rest of the state. Whereas, we live in Spokane, which is complete other side of the state, 250 miles from Seattle. And it is largely overwhelmed by homeless. I think the last count, Spokane's about a 500,000, give or take, population. And the last count there was well over 10,000 individuals that were homeless. Wow. And, really kind of, again, the society has been, I had a friend, they were talking about an instance that was in Seattle or Portland. And really, they have the same policies. Mm-hmm. They were outside of a bar and they happened to have a drink. And a cop said, "Hey, you can't have an open container." And he's like, "Yeah, but that guy can shoot up right over there. And there's a guy like 6 feet away that is actively injecting some type of, heroin,
something
substance into his veins." And they're like, "Yeah, you can." And that's the reality of what's going on in a lot of these Western cities. And it's just kind of like the solution has been, we're going to, defund the police. We're going to allow all of this open drug use because that was the solution.
This event took place on Saturday over the Memorial Weekend in Seattle, which is a major U.S. city considered. Yeah. The part that also stuck out to me, speaking of defunding the police, is that they made 23 arrests, which is a decent size number. But if you read the article, they're like, our police force we don't have the capacity or the ability to make this size of arrests and handle these types of size arrests because we're not in a position to take on this man. And I'm like, in Seattle, that's a pretty big city. They said they don't have the materials to protect themselves to use in situations like this. They don't have the
just a couple weeks ago, there was a when Turning Point, which is Charlie Kirk, they had an event at the University of Washington, which is in Greater Seattle as well. And within that, they had Antifa that overtook one of the engineering buildings. There was
at the university.
At the university, they took over this engineering building. The police force was in no way capable of being able to handle it, and there were people within the Greater Seattle that were applauding them, as opposed to having just a regular peaceful protest. So you have a conservative voice come to campus who has been to nearly every campus in the country, it seems like, and have we ever heard reports of like major like issues where they're like going after people? No, Charlie Kirk goes, has amazing conversations with people. You see the videos, whether you agree with it or not. I think he has very good conversations with people, and yet he plans to come to UW, University of Washington, and you have this group that goes largely off the rails where they are overtaking a building, they're starting fires, they're
breaking in.
Well,
breaking
they were antagonizing different people. They were chasing them to their cars, where a lot of people felt tremendously unsafe. And one of the questions is like, well, is this, domestic terrorism or not? And it's like, honestly, if you're overtaking a university building, that should be viewed as terrorism. Like, you were causing terror. And yet the state just kind of, they said, well, they have the right to do that. They didn't have a permit. They didn't do anything peacefully. And then you have this event just a week or two later of an organization that went through the proper channels, and now all of a sudden they're the bad ones. So that's what's going on. Here's one of the other things. Last week, the governor in Washington signed in a new budget. This new budget is $9 billion in new taxes.
Jesus.
This is roughly 12% of the overall budget. One thing that it did do is it put the state into a bigger deficit by $3 billion.
Jesus.
And one of the things that the governor had said, and, there's a lot of trade groups that were like, hey, you said when you got elected that you were going to stand up for us, you were going to be fiscally responsible. And he made all of these, declarations. And then when it came down to it, didn't hold up to any of them. One of them was that he had in the budget, they were going to give $100 million to the state police forces. And now people are saying, where's that money? Because we don't see it in the budget.
I mean, that seems to be a major issue in the state of Washington, is the how underfunded and under-equipped the police force is.
Well, I mean, and that's where, there's been a statewide Doge, and where you see money going is actually into the hands of a lot of these groups, like the Antifa groups, where you have a lot of these, whatever special interest groups that are making their way of funding. No different than what happened on the U.S. government side. We've seen that in the state of Washington, and it's just kind of like, what's going to change it? And it's a conversation between myself and others. It's like, when I moved here 16 years ago, I mean, it was a pretty conservative state. We had a well-running, the budget was balanced. You had even to the year of a surplus. I think the last surplus was in 2010. And then when the last governor took over, and then this current one, we are now running towards a $19 billion deficit by the end of this current budget.
I mean, so they're calling for this mayor to apologize. Some people are calling for him to step down. I mean, it seems like, based on a lot of factors, someone should be held accountable. And also the fact that, reading the article, again, I wasn't there, you weren't there, but reading the article, you have these you have these, May Day was the conservative group there, these conservative Christians talking about, their different philosophies and against abortion and things like that, able to speak their voice. And then you have, these agitators come in and cause chaos. But then in the press release from the mayor, it's like, it only blames one group. There's no like accountability for, hey, let me dive into this and who was responsible for what. It like really just like went against, if you were a Christian and you were a conservative, you were causing chaos and panic, and that doesn't seem right.
One of the things that, and again, I think it's fair to say, the founder of this protest has tried to ruffle a lot of feathers. And to say that we're going to have this clash, There's been other events throughout the state where he has caused this clash. Now, I think part of that is, even if it is someone who is going to be outspoken to a point that maybe you or I wouldn't be, he still has the right, based upon the First Amendment, to peacefully organize and protest, right?
Right.
Everyone has that right. And I don't think there's anything that you've said that I've said that go against that. What I think is the challenge of what you just brought up is how the mayor came out and condemned the person who went through the proper channels to have this organized event,
Yeah.
and essentially stood up for the antagonizers and saying, well, they were in their right capacity to stand against this and cause, violence. And, there's a point, it's like, well, maybe there were people that ended up doing things that we didn't agree with, but that's a lot of back after the fact. And it's kind of like, no, what you came out and said is, we're not going to let organizations stand up against the values of the city in the city's promotion of, we are going to stand up for the LGBTQ, instead of saying, hey, we're going to stand up for anyone that has differing opinions. That's the right of our citizens. That isn't what he said. He chose a side instead of saying, hey, we have people in this community that have completely different values. And instead of saying, we are going to embrace the difference of opinion and people can have, different values. The greatest value that we have is the freedom of speech to allow people to peacefully express. Right. And that is not what happened. And that's, I think, the great challenge that we've seen throughout this country, and where maybe there's different communities than others that are really in the center of this. And it comes back to me, it's, as much as we've seen, the far right as the far left, both of them, right, are kind of this very in your face, antagonistic. We're going to come out with face masked up and all black, or we're going to come out in, MAGA hats and red, white, and blue, and, show of force. Either way, it's kind of like, hey, 75% of the rest of the state wants no part of this.
Right. I was going to say.
And unfortunately, that's where, in a state that is, I'm going to go back, very woke, it said that, oh, sorry, you don't have a place here.
You don't have a voice. You don't have an opinion.
Well, not even a voice. It's like, you don't have a place here.
Right.
Like, there was a comment after the election where the Democratic governor was elected, and somebody made a comment. It's like, hey, you're now the governor. Are you going to, stand up for the rights of all citizens? And he goes, yes. And then all of a sudden he turned around and goes, no, I'm protecting my interests. And it's like, dude, 45% of your state, because that was the national election, voted for Trump. And new governor's first words out of his mouth, very first news conference, which he didn't have for 3 or 4 days after he was elected, he came out and said, I led the charge in the last Trump administration, filing lawsuits against Trump. Mm. And he said, I will continue to do the same. And it's kind of like, instead, like, how about you stand up for your people in the state? Now, granted, we all have different opinions, and it's a wide berth. That's great. But instead of coming out so outlandish and saying, hey, I'm going to completely shun one group over the other, that's where, again, this mayor has the backing of a lot of representatives in the state. And it is a, whether it's a powder keg that's ready to explode or not, I'm not sure. But it is very often where, the traditional Christian values, whether that's extreme or not, are quite under attack in many regions of this country. And I think that's where a lot of people don't understand how egregious it's been in some parts of the country.
Yeah. And I have a friend who moved out, I've told you this, moved out of Washington, 5 kids, because the school system, right? He's not, I grew up with him. He's not particularly religious. I'm not particularly religious. It was just more of like, I have a certain philosophy, of how I'd want my young, we're talking about 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds to be educated. And we don't want them learning about certain sexual orientations and things at such a young age. We think it should be done later. And also rights to how and who knows what about our children. And they left the state and they moved to Texas. Like, can they go back? Like, will the state?
I mean, that's what's interesting is one of the things that the governor signed into effect last week was a parental Bill of Rights, essentially. And one of the great pushing points on that is that the school districts have 48 hours before they're required to notify anyone of any sexual assault.
Why? I don't understand.
That's what we don't. Most people in the state don't understand. Why would you go to that point if one of your children is sexually assaulted within the school has no requirement, and it's trying to understand, well, why is this? And it's all right. Are there cases of where maybe it's happening at home, and so that's where and why? Okay, but what that opens up the door for a whole lot of other things. And when we come into the gender point of view, Washington is very loudly about allowing transgender kids to compete in whichever gender that they identify. And right? There's been different school districts that have said, nah, we're going to follow the federal rulings. And right. One of the pieces of this legislation was if they do so, they can be turned in and all state funding will be withheld. And, so it's this major, shootout at the OK Corral of, you have state leaders that are pretty much trying to say, we don't care what the president is saying. We're going to forcibly do different.
Do the opposite.
Do the opposite. And what's hard is when you're in a state that is, controlled by all one party, and yet 45% of the state voted for the candidate who is now in their office.
I'm on a call, buddy.
It just makes it hard. And I think that's where, again, what plays out here and like your friend and many others that have said, the idea, like one of the things that came out in this new administration is their view. If your child is old enough to get pregnant, they're old enough to state all of their own rights, have their own rights and freedoms. And that was verbatim. That was exactly word for word that came out. And, one of the other things that the state absolutely holds to the fact is over the age of, I think, 13, maybe 14, that parents have no right to have access to any of their children's medical records.
It seems insane. And to your point, there's 45% of the population that doesn't agree with this. Do they just go do you just go, or do you go can the pendulum swing back the other direction? Like, is it gone? Like what happens?
I mean, that's what's interesting. And maybe this, situation in Seattle where it's going to come in and say, hey, all right, you get more of the pushback against what I would say the extreme woke, just as much as, hey, if I want people to hear this and understand, if it was the extreme right, we had that a few years ago in Idaho, dude, there's not a place for that either. And, they were, arrested. There were, whether it was Memorial Day several years ago, where there was a bunch of arrests. You have special interest groups that came out and caused I would say a ruckus is the best way to term it. I really do wonder at what point there's going to be more of a pushback, and where does this start? Because if there's a greater pushback in California, where again, more organizations that are, saying that, hey, you said Mr. Governor, you said you were going to stick up for us, and you instead didn't. You doubled down on a lot of taxation. You didn't clean up the budget. You essentially allowed your party's administrators, their representatives, to go do whatever, again in these terms, in which didn't end up being fiscally responsible. And I think it comes back to, and this was brought up, it's like, California and Washington, Oregon have some of the worst homelessness rates in the United States.
Horrible. I've been California. I remember first couple months in LA. I just been moved there. This is 2019, 2018. Driving down from like Rodeo Drive, right? $20 million houses, driving down the road, and there's a lady defecating on the sidewalk in broad daylight, and there's cops on the corner. They don't do anything.
Yeah.
Just going.
Well, I mean, in a lot of those cases, they can't, or they arrest them, they take them in, and then they're right back out on the street in 45 minutes. And yet, the states that we're talking about have some of the largest collective budgets for homelessness, prevention, advocacy, whatever, of any other state in the country. And you're like, at some point, it's kind of like, hey, whatever you're doing is not working. It's not working.
It's not.
It's not working. And when you look to other regions, you mentioned Texas earlier, or other states that are saying, hey, maybe adopt those plans, and quickly then it becomes to, instead of saying, hey, whatever they're doing is working, it is, we will never do that because we don't agree with their politics.
It just seems so splintered in like yours in Washington and California, Oregon, where why can't I just don't, it doesn't, I get, maybe because I don't know how I was raised. You have a community, LGBTQ community there. If you're a Christian, be a Christian. If you're a Muslim, be a Muslim. Do what you want. Respect one another.
That's the last piece. That's the last piece that I think is the focus. Is I think it's both ways. Yeah. Is there are some cultures in this country that don't respect differences. Absolutely. If you look different, act different, we don't respect you. And I think collectively throughout the years, if it's, certain, I would say white nationalist to Christian nationalist, it has been stood against. And now all of a sudden we see it going the other way. That if there's a, this pendulum towards, hey, you have to show, almost appreciation. Appreciation and respect are different in my opinions. Appreciation, like, yes, I want to live those values, as opposed to, those aren't my values, but I respect you have the ability to have those values and live those values. That's fine. Don't condemn me because I have different, or don't force your values on me. And yet we see this pendulum going so far that way, where there's not this equitable respect. I think we've talked about this before at times. Malcolm Gladwell, I think in one of his books, he recants the story of a gentleman who was a KKK Grand Master who ended up being imprisoned, and there was a black gentleman that came and became friends with him. Yeah. And the individual ended up leaving the KKK. Well, how did that happen? It wasn't because he went and condemned him. He went and became his friend. He went and said, I don't agree with you, but I want to get to know you. I want to understand why. And I think that's where, again, on both sides of this, it's like, instead of saying I'm wrong because I live here on 10 acres in eastern part of Washington and I have cows and I enjoy that part of our, the region and the landscape. Don't condemn me because that's what I want to live. And I choose not to, embrace values that aren't my own. And yet at the same point, what it seems like in some parts of the country is that's been accepted. And, we've seen this in other states, other regions where, there's this grand pushback. And again, I think it's a challenge in our society because I think in some areas, in some individuals have said, I am going to stand against anyone that could possibly, I don't want to say be conservative, but have any appreciation for the current president. Oh, you are the worst of worst because of all this rhetoric that's been played out. And we haven't touched on this. In the last week, I talked about the Trump trip to the Middle East. But a lot of what's coming out in regard to what's happened the last 4 years in regards to, big media and what stories they've contrived and made up. And now all of a sudden they're like, oh, This was not true. This was not the case. And, whether it's from COVID through, now we're seeing issues with insurance companies to across the board. And you're like, ooh, and it's going to get more interesting in the next few months and not less.
I mean, my question to you is, for leaders, for people that have organizations in some of these states, because I've encountered this personally with individuals who have a team of 20, 30, 40, 50, 150 and bigger, that majority of a team may have a certain viewpoint politically and a minority has a certain viewpoint, and it is affecting business, affecting interpersonal relationships, business relationships, financially. How does a leader, do they just succumb? What I've seen is they just succumb to the majority voice and do what they had to do. Is that the right approach? I mean, it seems so delicate.
I think this is what's really interesting and why you see organizations pushing against the DEI policies is in those circumstances, and the people that I've talked with who are, DEI trainers of past to people that have a very staunch opinion on DEI. And I think it all centers back to one is the expression of values. Mm-hmm. And I think what's happened in a lot of organizations is an organization will have an expression of values. And then over the last few years, it's been forced within their organization to say, hey, those values don't work for anyone, so you can't uphold those values. And certain leaders are like, I don't want to deal with it. Let's pick the easy way out. Or my board says that I need to follow these actions that are going to make us more, appealing to everyone. And all of a sudden you get to situations where the owners, the leadership are like, we have values in the organizations that we don't agree with. And unfortunately, that's what's going on with a lot of organizations. And I think it comes back to this idea that the freedom of choice, meaning if I don't agree with the values, instead of coming in and saying, I'm going to force my values upon you, that I can go find a home where my values apply. And that should be okay. And just as much an owner should say, hey, if you don't appreciate my values, that's okay. I'm cool to stand that way. And unfortunately, that has been deemed discriminatory, even though I would say in most cases, it's a problem if you don't uphold value. If we go to any leadership trainer, any cultural trainer, they will say values trump everything else. And yet we find this situation where it's kind of like, oh, if you have values that aren't my own, you need to uptake my values so I feel welcome, instead of saying, hey, we have different values. And that's okay. And I'm going to uphold what this organization is about and the values that we stand for. And if you don't agree with that, that's okay. You can choose to not agree with that, but then it's not going to be here. And we haven't seen leaders be able to stand with such firmness, which in the reality causes more harm when you don't, because it brings back the point where somebody walks into a company. It's like, what do you value or not? I think Starbucks is in the absolute middle of that firestorm.
Yeah.
Starbucks, whether you Howard Schultz and you get this or that, and they've waffled back and forth. And now all of a sudden they're starting to see their profits affected. And they're like, well, we need to go back and have a stronger dress code. And they're like, well, you can't all of a sudden stand up to us now. And you see all this pushback and you're like, actually we can. Like, we can have a uniform for our employees. Like, that's pretty normal. Now, we may have allowed you to get away with it for years, but now we're all of a sudden, it's kind of like a parent. Hey, no curfew, no curfew, no curfew. And all of a sudden now your grades suck. Hey, you have a curfew. Whoa, what do you mean? I had no curfew for years. How dare you put a curfew? Like, no, it's the same thing. And right. I think it's what happens is when you just turn a blind eye and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, this is a problem. This is causing profitability measures. And now all of a sudden the major shareholders are like, fix it. Just hold on to your values. And it's okay. You don't agree with my values? Great. Those are my values. I can choose to change them. But that's my choice as opposed to you forcing them upon me.
And I think a good point too is like where I feel like a lot of people get it mixed up with like your values are racist. Your values mean hatred. It's like by having conservative Christian values, you are then pigeon or having liberal values, like you're automatically like, oh, that person like bucket into this.
Well,
Like,
I mean, what
tier
we've
of
seen happen in the last couple of weeks is,
how is that
I mean,
connect?
this has been voiced to my children in their school. This has been on major news media. There's videos left and right. The only racist people in this country are white men, are white people. And it's like, no, anyone can be racist. If you're living and breathing in this world, you could be racist. Absolutely. Like every race has that in them. It just does. And so to say that it's predominantly one or the other, or only one or the other, man, that's part of the problem. That's racism in and of itself. And it's, again, coming back to the, hey, I can have different values. Now, if my value says that I only value someone that is a male or female or, a lesbian or a transsexual or black or white or Indian or Asian, well, then all of a sudden that's an issue. That's not a value set. That's a sexist, racist,
That's
bigotry. That's totally
yeah.
different as opposed to, I appreciate honesty. That's and when values are regardless of gender, age, or race, then all of a sudden they're a value if there's a gender. But here's the problem is where it's gotten so sticky is, and this is where the conversations you and I've had with, as part of our podcast with leaders in these different, DEI trainings, like, yeah, where it all went wrong is the solution was to start to segregate by race, gender identification, and by,
Sexual orientation.
Yeah, all of it. And it's like, so, we need more equity, so we have to have more females here. Okay, that can be a great situation, but create the cultures, the values where they want to be a part of and allow it to happen. Pick the person based upon meritocracy. It doesn't mean it's going to happen overnight, because if you all of a sudden say, hey, we have board that is 8 people, and you know what? We need better equality. Tomorrow, we're going to get rid of 4 people because they're white men, and we're going to go find 2 black individuals, and we're going to go find, 2 Asian individuals, and that's our solution. It's like, whoa, that's just as discriminatory. Stop and listen to what you were saying. And that's kind of been a pass, because that's been the force for equality, instead of saying, man, we value that all genders are equal, that all races are equal. We want to find people that uphold those values. And if you fit in those values, then you're for us, whatever you look like. And it hasn't been done that way, but yet there's an individual interviewed a couple times, Gil Winch. He created an entire organization that way, and it can be done. It just doesn't happen overnight, because you have to create and live out the values where people then feel safe to say, oh, I want to be here. Yeah. Okay. And if not, that's okay too, because honestly, people have the right to do that. We may not agree with, again, freedom of speech and yeah.
Yeah. It's I mean, hey, it's great to debate and talk. I think you bring a lot of knowledge and wisdom to that, because I think it gets what the difference between a value and like a system in your mind of like color or race or identity,
ideology.
Yeah, they're different things, and that's where I think there's a lot of this confusion.
Well,
it's like,
I think that's been one of the great things that I've learned from my mentor, John Maxwell, who, has written the book, Change Your World. And it's not about ideologies. It's about values. What do you value? And one of the great lessons that I learned from him and practice is you and I, let's say, for example, just in this conversation, that you and I have a shared value of integrity. Okay. Your word is your word. However we individually describe that. Well, I may have an assumption of what integrity means to me, and you may mean to you. But until we start discussing that and saying, this is what I believe integrity is, this is how I shows up, this is how you display it, this is where until we have that conversation, they could be as different as the Cleveland Browns and the New York Jets. I mean, they could be that different in the helmet, in what they do, and it's that different, even though it's the same word. And that's where I think the great opportunity with organizations, and I talked about this a little bit at my event with Jenny Catrone. It's like, organizations that sit down and talk about their values at every meeting. Hey, how was integrity displayed today? Okay, now we understand, what does integrity mean to you? Like, how important it is on a scale of 1 to 10. When we have those conversations, now all of a sudden someone can say, it's like, they're all about integrity, but that it just didn't seem right or genuine to me because I didn't agree with that. Fine, great, go do you. Like, it's okay. So all of this because the mayor in Seattle chose to impress upon everyone else his values. Maybe there are the values of the community, but I would, again, really to this conversation, this is what it comes down to, is I think he really talked about ideologies and not values.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Talk about bringing it full circle.
That's what we do.
Awesome. Well, thanks for watching. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button as well as the bell to be notified whenever we drop new content. If you're on LinkedIn and Facebook, please just go ahead and comment. Would love to carry on this conversation with you, what your thoughts and beliefs are. And let's have that conversation about ideologies and values and how they show up. Till next time, choose to lead with impact.